That field doesn't belong to you anymore. Leave now, or we'll call the police, someone from component placement barked. The project manager didn't hesitate. He shoved the elderly farmer off the land, the very soil he'd worked and nurtured for over 40 years. Bystanders looked on but said nothing. No one intervened. But exactly one day later, the silence was shattered. Over 100 veterans from across the state arrived, assembling in formation right in front of that same field. A brotherhood shaped by war had come together once more, this time, not in combat, but in solidarity. Welcome to Uncovered Tales, where we reveal the stories others bury. Walter Hayes was 67, but he wasn't just some aging farmer. After completing 2 tours in Vietnam and serving with honor, he had come home to the only life he understood, working the land passed down by his father. For decades, his weather-beaten hands had coaxed life from the earth, growing corn, squash, and beans. And he didn't keep it all for himself. He shared it with neighbors, with strangers, whoever needed it. His little roadside stand had earned a quiet fame across 3 counties, all thanks to a simple principle: take what you need, pay what you can. Just after sunrise one morning, a convoy of development vehicles pulled up to his gate. The sleek black SUVs looked jarringly out of place next to the faded fence posts and modest farmhouse where the American flag had waved every day since 1975. A group of men in sharp suits stepped out, clipboards in hand, walking confidently across the dew-covered grass. Their polished shoes soaked instantly in the damp earth. "Mr. Hayes," the project manager called out, not even bothering to remove his sunglasses. "This land's been rezoned for commercial development by local authorities. The compensation package was mailed to you 3 months ago. We need the area cleared immediately to stay on schedule." Walter just stood there, stunned. He gripped his worn leather gloves tightly, the weight of those words sinking in. "I never agreed to anything," he said, voice low but steady. "I never signed a single paper. This farm, it's all I have. If I leave, where am I supposed to go?" The man's tone turned icy. "Whether you think it's right or not doesn't matter. That's for the courts to decide. The county already signed off on the permits. Progress doesn't have time for nostalgia." Walter refused to budge. So they started tearing it down. The workers moved in, ripping fence posts out of the soil, posts that had stood since his father's time. Newly sprouted seedlings were stomped underfoot, plants Walter had carefully started as soon as the frost lifted. Some were heirloom varieties passed down through generations. One laborer even gave him a hard shove, sending Walter stumbling back. "Just call it quits, old man. Your time's over. No one farms like this anymore anyway." Neighbors peeked out from their homes. A few came closer, watching quietly. Some pulled out phones to record, but none stepped in. None spoke. One woman dropped her gaze when Walter met her eyes. She'd once relied on his vegetables to feed her family during hard times. As the hours dragged on, Walter's strength began to fade. The paperwork shoved at him was full of dense legal jargon he couldn't decipher. The signatures didn't even look familiar. And by lunchtime, bulldozers were already cutting into the northern edge of his land, flattening the apple trees his grandfather had planted decades ago. As the sun sank low in the sky, Walter sat alone on a splintered fence post. Dirt clung to his face, and his fingers closed around a handful of the dark, damp earth he'd tended for most of his life. But his eyes were dry. Veterans, he'd always been told, don't cry. Not even when everything they built is torn apart. As twilight crept in, a news van drove off, satisfied with a few clips for a shallow human interest piece. The reporter hadn't asked about Walter's history, or what the land meant to him. They were far more interested in the fancy shopping center going up. Walter stood there, watching the taillights disappear, then looked down at the dirt in his palm. This wasn't just land. This wasn't just property. It was the only place he had ever truly felt safe since returning from the war. The only ground that had helped him quiet the nightmares that still chased him. The next morning, clips of Walter being pushed off his land exploded online. But something was off. The videos were edited and spun to paint him as an out-of-touch old man blocking progress and jobs. Local news ran with the narrative, elderly farmer resists approved project that will create 300 new jobs in the area. One popular talk show host chimed in. Yeah, it's unfortunate. But we can't let emotions stall economic growth. Sometimes the past has to step aside for the future. That's just how it goes. People Walter had known for decades suddenly stopped returning his calls. A neighbor who had once praised Walter's garden said with a shrug. Yeah, it's sad. But what can you do? Times change. Honestly, I wouldn't mind having a closer place to shop. I'm tired of driving 30 minutes for decent clothes. Even the local diner, where Walter had eaten breakfast every Sunday morning for 40 years, now claimed to be fully booked. The waitress who had served him for 2 decades couldn't even meet his gaze as the manager gently asked him to leave. We're slammed today, Walter. Maybe come back tomorrow, okay? Walter wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not without trying. He climbed into his old pickup and drove straight to the county clerk's office, determined to make his voice heard. When he reached the counter, the clerk didn't even look up, her eyes glued to the screen in front of her. The paperwork's already been finalized, she said in a monotone, barely acknowledging his presence. There's no legal ground for your complaint. The county board approved the rezoning unanimously 6 months ago. Walter's voice rose as frustration cracked through his calm. I never got any notice, he insisted. That land has been in my family for 3 generations. I didn't even get a chance to speak at the hearing. The clerk finally glanced at him, her expression unmoved. Sir, please keep your voice down, she replied, with a touch of warning in her tone. The notice was legally published in the county bulletin. If you missed it, that's not our responsibility. If you continue to be disruptive, security will be called to escort you out. Defeated and heavy-hearted, Walter turned and walked out of the building. The very system he'd risked his life to defend now seemed unwilling to defend him. The tiny American flag pin on his lapel, once a badge of honor, now felt like a cruel reminder of a promise broken. That evening, he found himself alone in his garage, surrounded by memories no one else could see. He pulled out a time-worn wooden box that held his medals, battlefield maps, and black and white photos of fellow soldiers, most of them gone now. With shaky hands, he took down the American flag that had flown outside his home since the day he came back from Vietnam. Out the window, he could see the outlines of his field, staked off with orange tape, dotted with surveyor flags. He twisted his wedding ring, still on his finger after all these years, even though Ruth had passed long ago. She would have known what to say. Ruth always had a way of making sense of things when he couldn't. His thoughts drifted to war-torn jungles and the sounds of gunfire. He remembered the men who never made it back, the ones who died with thoughts of home and peace in their hearts. And now, the very soil they dreamed of, the land that had helped him heal, was being taken from him, one bulldozer at a time. In the distance, powerful construction lights lit up the field. Crews were preparing for overnight work. They weren't wasting a minute. By sunrise, nothing would remain of his cornfield. Walter slowly placed his bronze star back in the box. No one seemed to remember what that medal meant anymore. No one remembered what it had cost. The citation said, "For valor under extreme duress." But where was valor now? Where was honor? He looked around and realized, no one was standing with him. No one seemed to care that he had once risked everything for this country. If you believe this is deeply unjust, type H honor. The next morning, a deep, thunderous sound began to rise from the horizon, the unmistakable rumble of military transport vehicles and the synchronized thumping of boots on pavement. The noise grew louder, echoing across the valley, until even the demolition crews couldn't ignore it. Walter stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, his eyes widening at the scene unfolding before him. Encircling the entire perimeter of his land stood a silent army of veterans, clad in worn and faded uniforms. They carried no rifles, no shields, just a fierce sense of purpose and something even stronger than weapons. A towering banner stretched across the front. This land was earned, not bought. Veterans from every military branch were there, representing generations, from Vietnam all the way to Afghanistan. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a living wall. At the front of the line was retired Colonel Elias Ward, his uniform adorned with gleaming medals that caught the early morning light. He moved with a slight limp, a permanent injury from the same battle in Vietnam where Walter had once dragged him to safety. The colonel walked up to Walter and offered a sharp salute. "We're not here to stage a protest, Hayes," he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying across the suddenly hushed field. "We're here to honor. This man saved our lives. And this country does not abandon its heroes." Every piece of machinery came to a halt. Construction workers froze. Cameras began to roll as reporters and news crews scrambled to capture what was quickly becoming a stunning display of unity. One veteran with silver hair stepped forward, holding a worn military map. He unfolded it slowly, revealing Walter's name, highlighted clearly as the field operator during the 1968 Tet Offensive. He had held radio contact under fire, despite being hit, twice. Then another veteran stepped into view. Without a word, he opened his shirt, revealing a long, deep scar that stretched across his chest. "Walter carried me 8 kilometers back to base after our convoy was ambushed," he said, voice trembling. "I wouldn't be here today without him. I wouldn't have my wife. My kids wouldn't be alive." One after another, they spoke. Each shared their own story, testimonies of bravery, quiet sacrifices, and moments of grit and humanity. Stories Walter had never told. Not to neighbors. Not even to family. Tales of a young soldier who had risked his life over and over for his brothers in arms, and had never asked for a single thing in return. National news outlets quickly picked up the story and began broadcasting it live. Within hours, social media was flooded with images of veterans standing shoulder to shoulder, a living wall of unity and defiance. Hashtags demanding justice for Walter spread like wildfire across platforms. The public outcry was impossible to ignore. By mid-morning, the governor's office had released a statement, promising to immediately investigate the situation. People who had seen the veterans on TV began showing up in person. Locals brought food, bottled water, and American flags. Kids lined up to get autographs from the veterans. Elderly neighbors, some of whom had silently watched the demolition the day before, now stood proudly beside them, many clutching old photos of Walter at harvest festivals, charity drives, and town parades he'd helped organize through the years. Then a young attorney stepped forward. He introduced himself as the son of a soldier Walter had once carried to safety. "I'll represent you free of charge, sir. What they've done isn't just wrong on a moral level, I believe it's legally flawed too. They buried the notification process on purpose. We'll take this all the way to the state Supreme Court if we have to." Later that afternoon, the development company scrambled to release a statement of their own. "Due to community concerns, we are pausing all construction to reevaluate the project's impact. We respect and honor the service of veterans and are committed to finding a solution that reflects those values." As daylight began to fade, Walter found himself surrounded by the same soldiers he had once stood beside in battle. They formed a circle around him, every one of them standing at attention, saluting him not as a friend, but as a leader. Colonel Ward stepped forward again, and together with Walter, they raised the American flag high above the field, planting it into a mound of soil left behind by the bulldozers. The last rays of sunlight caught glints of moisture in the eyes of these grizzled warriors, men who had vowed long ago never to cry again. And for the first time in decades, Walter Hayes let the tears fall, no longer holding them back. A week later, Walter's land was officially designated as a Veterans Memorial Community Space, at least while legal proceedings continued. What started as a moment of protest had grown into something much bigger, a nationwide reckoning about how we treat those who serve and what community truly means. Children from the neighborhood started coming by to learn how to garden under Walter's guidance. Together, they replanted the rows of crops that had been destroyed, not just Walter, but dozens of volunteers from all walks of life. Local businesses pitched in, donating seeds, tools, and equipment. One contractor even offered to repair the damaged sections of Walter's farmhouse, free of charge. One afternoon, a little girl pressed a seed into the soil and looked up at Walter. "Mr. Walter, is this really your land again?" she asked as she gently covered the seed with earth. Walter gave her a soft smile. "No, sweetheart. It belongs to anyone brave enough to stand up for what's right. It belongs to people like you, who will keep growing things long after I'm gone." A woman brought flowers and placed them near the field's edge. She was the widow of a soldier Walter had tried to save during one of their last missions. "He always said you were the bravest," she whispered to him, her voice shaking. "Not just in war, but in life. Because you came back and kept living. You stayed connected to the land. You made peace with the past." National media dubbed him the silent veteran who made the system listen. Opinion pieces began debating not only Walter's case, but similar stories from across the country, instances where development had displaced elderly or vulnerable landowners. Investigative journalists dug deeper and uncovered that the same development company had used nearly identical tactics in at least 7 other towns, quietly targeting senior property owners with vague notices and tight deadlines. At a special town hall, broadcast live across the country, members of the county board were confronted by furious citizens. "How could you take land from a decorated veteran without notifying him directly?" asked a young mother, holding up a picture of her father in uniform. "Is this really how we thank the people who serve this country?" The development company, now facing intense public backlash and boycotts of its other projects, announced a complete overhaul of their plans. The revised project would preserve Walter's farm as an educational hub and community garden, surrounded by locally owned shops instead of big-box chains. "We've heard the voices of the people," said the CEO in a formal statement, though many remained skeptical of the company's sincerity. 3 months later, a formal ceremony was held on the land once marked for demolition. The same American flag that had flown for years outside Walter's quiet home was now ceremoniously folded with precision and returned to him, this time, handed over by the very veterans he had saved decades earlier, their hair now gray, their backs still straight. As Walter accepted the flag, Colonel Ward stepped up to speak to the assembled crowd. "America isn't just a patch of land, it's a promise," he said. "And that promise is that those who sacrifice for her will never be left behind or forgotten." Today, we honor that promise, not just for Walter, but for all of us. Walter's story didn't end there. It spread far beyond his town, inspiring action across the country. Veterans groups began creating community gardens on abandoned lots. Legal aid clinics opened in 5 states, focusing specifically on helping veterans facing land disputes. A bipartisan bill was introduced in Congress that would require more transparent notification laws for veterans at risk of losing their property. And Walter? He kept farming, but this time, he wasn't alone. Every Saturday, volunteers joined him to learn the rhythms of the earth, skills many feared had been lost to time. He launched a program teaching sustainable agriculture to returning veterans, many of whom found peace and purpose in the quiet labor of tending to the soil. "Not everyone who loses their land loses everything," a national magazine wrote in a cover story about him. "Some stand in the rubble and still manage to plant hope, for a generation, for a country, for a future that remembers. Some battles are fought with rifles. Others with resilience. With unity. With an unshakable belief in justice." The final image, a sea of American flags fluttering above rows of newly planted crops, bright green against the dark soil, became a symbol of remembrance, of resistance, of rebirth. You might scroll past this story in a few days. But if no one tells it, it will disappear. Subscribe to Uncovered Tales, where memory, justice, and kindness are never forgotten.